Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. George Osborne. George Gideon Oliver Osborne is a British Conservative Party politician who was Member of Parliament for Tatton from June 2001 until he stood down on 3 May 2017. He served as Chancellor of the Exchequer under Prime Minister David Cameron from 2010 to 2016. In March 2017, he was appointed editor of the London Evening Standard and started the role in May. He announced that he would not stand at the 2017 general election. Osborne worked briefly as a freelancer for the Daily Telegraph before joining the Conservative Research Department in 1994 and becoming head of its political section. He went on to be a special advisor to Douglas Hogg, the Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, and worked at 10 Downing Street as well as for Prime Minister John Major's campaign team in the party's unsuccessful 1997 general election campaign, before becoming a speechwriter and political secretary to Major's successor as party leader, William Hague. Osborne was elected as MP for Tatton in 2001, becoming the youngest Conservative member of the House of Commons. He was appointed Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury by Conservative leader Michael Howard in 2004. The following year he ran David Cameron's successful party leadership campaign. Cameron then appointed him Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and, after the 2010 general election, Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government. As Chancellor, Osborne pursued austerity policies aimed at reducing the national debt. After the Conservatives won an overall majority in the 2015 general election, Cameron reappointed him Chancellor in his second government, and gave him the additional title of First Secretary of State. Following the 2016 referendum vote to leave the European Union and Cameron's consequent resignation, Osborne was sacked by newly appointed Prime Minister Theresa May, and returned to the backbenches. He stepped down as an MP in the 2017 general election. Early life and education. George Osborne was born in Paddington, London. As Gideon Oliver Osborne, he decided when he was 13 to be known by the additional first name of George. In an interview in July 2005, he said, "It was my small act of rebellion. I never liked it, the name, Gideon. When I finally told my mother, she said, 'Nor do I.' So I decided to be George after my grandfather, who was a war hero. Life was easier as a George. It was a straightforward name." He is the eldest of 4 boys. His father, Sir Peter Osborne, co-founded the firm of fabric and wallpaper designers Osborne and Little. His mother is Felicity Alexandra Loxton-Peacock, the daughter of Hungarian-born artist Clarice Loxton-Peacock. Osborne was educated at independent schools, Norland Place School, Collick Court and St Paul's School. In 1990 he was awarded a demyship at Magdalen College, Oxford, where in 1993 he received a 2:1 bachelor's degree in modern history. Whilst there, he was a member of the Bullingdon Club. He also attended Davidson College in North Carolina for a semester, as a Dean Rusk Scholar. In 1993, Osborne intended to pursue a career in journalism. He was shortlisted for, but failed to gain a place on, the Times trainee scheme. He also applied to The Economist, where he was interviewed and rejected by Gideon Rachman. In the end, he had to settle for freelance work on the Peterborough Diary column of the Daily Telegraph. One of his Oxford friends, journalist George Bridges, alerted Osborne some time later to a research vacancy at Conservative Central Office. Early political career. Osborne joined the Conservative Research Department in 1994. and became head of its political section. One of his first roles was to go to Blackpool and observe the October 1994 Labour Party conference. Between 1995 and 1997 he worked as a special advisor to the Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food Douglas Hogg, and in the political office at 10 Downing Street. Osborne worked on Prime Minister John Major's campaign team in 1997, in the run-up to the Trees heavy election defeat that year. After the election, he again considered journalism, approaching the Times to be a leader writer, though nothing came of it. Between 1997 and 2001 he worked for William Hague, Major's successor as Conservative Party leader, as a speechwriter and political secretary. He helped to prepare Hague for the weekly session of Prime Minister's Questions, often playing the role of Prime Minister Tony Blair. Under the subsequent leaderships of Michael Howard and David Cameron, he remained on the Prime Minister's Questions team. Member of Parliament. Osborne was elected as the Member of Parliament for Tatton, Cheshire, at the June 2001 election. He succeeded independent MP Martin Bell, who had defeated the controversial former Conservative Minister Neil Hamilton in 1997, but had kept his promise not to stand there at the following election. Osborne won, with a majority of 8,611 over the Labour candidate, becoming the youngest Conservative MP in the House of Commons. At the 2005 election, he was re-elected with an increased majority of 11,731, and in 2010 increased his majority still further to 14,487. Shadow Chancellor 2005-2010. He was appointed in September 2004 by then Conservative leader Michael Howard to the Shadow Cabinet, as Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Following the 2005 general election, Howard promoted him to Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer at the young age of 33. Howard had initially offered the post to William Hague, who turned it down. Press reports suggest that the second choice for the post was David Cameron, who also rejected the job, preferring to take on a major public service portfolio. Thus, Howard seems to have turned to Osborne as his third choice for the role. His promotion prompted speculation he would run for the leadership of the Conservative Party when Howard stepped down, but he ruled himself out within a week. Osborne served as campaign manager for David Cameron's leadership campaign, and kept the Shadow Chancellor's post when Cameron became leader later that year. When David Cameron was asked in 2009 whether or not he would be willing to sack a close colleague such as Osborne, he stated, "With George, the answer is yes. He stayed in my shadow cabinet not because he is a friend, not because we are godfathers to each other's children, but because he is the right person to do the job. I know, and he knows that if that was not the case he would not be there." At this time Osborne expressed an interest in the ideas of tax simplification. He set up a tax reform commission in October 2005 to investigate ideas for how to create a flatter, simpler tax system. The system then proposed would reduce the income tax rate to a flat 22%, and increase the personal allowance from £4,435 to between £10,000 and £15,500. However, the idea of a flat tax was not included in the 2010 Conservative Party manifesto. Each year between 2006 and 2009, Osborne attended the annual Bilderberg Conference, a meeting of influential people in business, finance and politics. Comments on Gordon Brown. During Osborne's response to the Chancellor of the Exchequer Gordon Brown's pre-budget report on 5 December 2005, he accused Brown of being a Chancellor past his sell-by date, a Chancellor holding Britain back. In an interview the same week, he also referred to Brown as brutal and unpleasant. Osborne was rebuked in October 2006 by Michael Martin, the Speaker of the House of Commons, when he attacked the Chancellor at oral questions by citing a comment attributed to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions John Houghton, describing the Chancellor as likely to make an effing awful Prime Minister. It was widely suggested that Osborne was leading an assault on Brown that would allow Conservatives to discredit him without damaging David Cameron's public image. That month, Osborne faced criticism from some quarters for appearing to suggest that Brown was faintly autistic. After Osborne spoke in an interview about his own ability to recall odd facts, a host suggested to him that he may have been faintly autistic. He responded by saying that, "We're not getting on to Gordon Brown yet." Pledge to match Labour spending. In September 2007, ahead of the publication of the 2007 Comprehensive Spending Review, Osborne pledged that the Conservative Party would match Labour's public spending plans for the next 3 years. He promised increases in public spending of 2% a year, calling Labour charges that the Conservatives would cut public spending a pack of lies. He also ruled out any upfront, unfunded tax cuts. The Deripaska claim. Osborne's school and university contemporary financier Nathaniel Rothschild said in October 2008 that Osborne had tried to solicit a £50,000 donation from the Russian aluminium magnate Oleg Deripaska, which would have been a violation of the law against political donations by foreign citizens. Rothschild had hosted Deripaska, Osborne, Peter Mandelson and others at a party in his villa in Corfu. The alleged solicitation of a donation occurred on Deripaska's yacht during the party. The Electoral Commission received a formal complaint initiated in a letter by the Liberal Democrats' Home Affairs spokesperson, Chris Huhne, urging them to investigate the allegations against Osborne. The commission rejected the claims and said it saw no information suggesting an offense. The accusation was referred to by the press as Yachtgate. Run on the pound. On 14 November 2008, in an intervention described by the BBC's Nick Robinson as pretty extraordinary, Osborne publicly warned that the more the government borrows, the less attractive sterling becomes to hold. He said, "We are in danger, if the government is not careful, of having a proper sterling collapse, a run on the pound," labelling Gordon Brown's tactic a scorched earth policy that a future Conservative government would have to clear up. Osborne continued, his view is he probably won't win the next election. The Tories can clear this mess up after I've gone. Expenses. In 2009 and 2012, Osborne was criticised for his expense claims, in particular for the claims for mortgage interest payments on his Cheshire properties. Osborne had funded the purchase of a country farmhouse and adjoining paddock in Cheshire before he became an MP in 2001. By way of a £455,000 extension of the mortgage on his London home. In 2003 he substituted a new £450,000 mortgage on the Cheshire property, which he then designated as his second home, or flipped. As a result, he was able to claim up to £100,000 in mortgage interest on the house and paddock between 2003 and 2010, when the regulations changed. In 2012 it was revealed that the paddock had been legally separate from the farmhouse. The Liberal Democrats said he had a moral obligation to pay an estimated £55,000 in capital gains tax to the public purse which he had saved through the designation, or flipping, of his London property as his main home. He had previously paid back £1,193 spent on chauffeur fares and overpayments on his mortgage after a complaint from a Labour activist. And it also emerged that he had claimed £47 for 2 copies of a DVD of his own speech on value for taxpayers' money. The report of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards found that although Osborne had breached the rules, the offence was unintended and relatively minor. Osborne said he had received flawed advice and not benefited personally. 2010 General Election Campaign. During the 2010 general election campaign, Osborne was considered to have been sidelined, owing to his perceived unpopularity and the perception by both Liberal Democrat and Labour strategists that he was a weak link. 2010 Osborne was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer on the 11th of May 2010, and was sworn in as a Privy Councillor the following day. Osborne acceded to the chancellorship in the continuing wake of the financial crisis. 2 of his first acts were setting up the Office for Budget Responsibility and commissioning a government-wide spending review, which was to conclude in autumn 2010 and to set limits on departmental spending until 2014-15. Shortly before the 2010 election, Osborne had pledged to be tougher than Thatcher on Britain's budget deficit, and he duly set himself the target of reducing the UK's deficit to the point that, in the financial year 2015-16, total public debt would be falling as a proportion of GDP. On the 24th of May 2010, Osborne outlined £6.2 billion cuts. "We simply cannot afford to increase public debt at the rate of £3 billion each week." Documents leaked from the Treasury the following month revealed that Osborne anticipated his tighter spending would lead to 1.3 million jobs being lost over the course of the Parliament. Osborne termed those who objected to his policy deficit deniers. In July 2010, while seeking cuts of up to 25% in government spending to tackle the deficit, Osborne insisted the £20 billion cost of building 4 new Vanguard-class submarine to bear Trident missiles had to be considered as part of the Ministry of Defence's core funding, even if that implied a severe reduction in the rest of the ministry's budget. Liam Fox, the Secretary of State for Defense, warned that if Trident were to be considered core funding, there would have to be severe restrictions in the way that the UK operated militarily. Osborne presented the government's spending review on the 20th of October, which fixed spending budgets for each government department up to 2014-15. Before and after becoming Chancellor, Osborne had alleged that the UK was on the verge of bankruptcy, though this assertion was criticised by the Treasury Select Committee and others as an effort to try and justify his programme of spending cuts. On the 4th of October 2010, in a speech at the Conservative conference in Birmingham, Osborne announced a cap on the overall amount of benefits a family can receive from the state, estimated to be around £500 a week from 2013. It was estimated that this could result in Indiana 5,000 unemployed families losing an average of £93 a week. He also announced that he would end the universal entitlement to child benefit, and that, From 2013, the entitlement would be removed from people paying the 40% and 50% income tax rates. 2011. In February 2011, Osborne announced Project Merlin, whereby banks aim to lend about £190 billion to businesses in 2011, curb bonuses and reveal some salary details of their top earners. Meanwhile, the bank levy would increase by £800 million. Liberal Democrat Treasury spokesman Lord Oakeshott resigned after the agreement was announced. Other pledges included providing £200 million of capital for David Cameron's Big Society Bank, which was supposed to finance community projects. In November 2011, Osborne sold Northern Rock to Richard Branson's Virgin Money for a price that was to range from £747 million to £1 billion. Northern Rock, the first British bank in 150 years to suffer a bank run, had been taken into public ownership in 2008, then divided into two entities on 1 January 2010, the other half being Northern Rock. The Independent described the entity sold as the detoxified arm of the bank, while saying the taxpayers retained responsibility for £20 billion of toxic assets such as bad debts and closed mortgages. The deal valued the bank at somewhat less than its £1.12 billion net asset value, and locks in a minimum loss for taxpayers of £373 million to £453 million. Osborne argued the deal would get more money back than any other deal on the table, and responded to concerns about the timing by saying that a secret deal between the previous Labour government and the European Commission in Brussels obliged them to sell the bank in a before 2013. And, given we were advised that Northern Rock plc would have been likely to remain loss-making until at least well into 2012, which would have depleted taxpayer resources still further, agreeing a sale now was even more imperative. 2012. The 2012 budget, dubbed the Omni-Shambles budget by the then Labour leader Ed Miliband, is viewed as the nadir of Osborne's political fortunes. Osborne cut the 50% income tax rate on top earners, which he said had been specially designated by his predecessor as temporary, to 45%. Figures from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs showed that the amount of additional rate tax paid had increased under the new rate, from £38 billion in 2012-13 to £46 billion in 2013-14, which Osborne said was caused by the new rate being more competitive. Osborne faced criticism for simultaneously imposing value-added tax on food such as Cornish pasties when served at above ambient temperature. Critics commented on the potential effect on vendors, with members of the Treasury Select Committee suggesting that Osborne was inexperienced with the issue after a comment that he couldn't remember the last time he had bought such a pasty from Greggs. The pasty tax proposal was later withdrawn in what was seen as a political U-turn, as were proposals to cut tax relief on charitable donations and to tax static caravans. In October 2012, Osborne proposed a new policy to boost the hiring of staff, under which companies would be able to give new appointees shares worth between £2,000 and £50,000. But the appointees would lose the right to claim unfair dismissal and time off for training. Osborne sent a letter in 2012 to Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, in an attempt to help HSBC's leadership avoid criminal charges over the bank's involvement in laundering drug money and in channeling money to countries under economic sanctions. Osborne suggested that if HSBC were to lose its banking license in the US. This could have negative consequences for the financial markets in Europe and Asia. HSBC avoided criminal charges, and settled with the U.S. Department of Justice for $1.92 billion. Budget deficit. In February 2013, the UK lost its AAA credit rating, which Osborne had indicated to be a priority when coming to power, for the first time since 1978. His March 2013 budget was made when the Office for Budget Responsibility had halved its forecast for that year's economic growth from 1.2% to 0.6%. It was described by the Daily Telegraph's economics editor as an inventive, scattergun approach to growth that half-ticked the demands of every policy commentator. Wrapped together under the Chancellor's banner of Britain as an aspiration nation. However, it was positively received by the public, with the ensuing boost to Conservative Party support in opinion polls standing in marked contrast to the previous year's budget. The economy subsequently began to pick up in mid-2013, with Osborne's net public approval rating rising from -33 to +3 over the following 12 months. By March 2015, the annual deficit had been cut by about half of the initial target, thus, the debt-to-GDP ratio was still rising. Also, the United Kingdom national debt increased more during the 5-year term than during the previous 13 years. Moreover, the economy deteriorated after the election owing to the uncertainty caused by the referendum. Reviewing his performance in July 2016, The Guardian said that the UK still had a budget deficit of 4%, a balance of payments deficit of 7% of GDP, and the worst productivity among the G7 nations. An Office for National Statistics graph including the period 2010 to 2016 shows a worsening balance of trade deficit. The Conservative manifesto for the 2015 general election contained a promise not to raise income tax, VAT, or national insurance for the duration of the Parliament. Journalist George Eaton maintains that Osborne did not expect an outright Conservative majority, and expected his Liberal Democrat coalition partners to make him break that promise. May 2015–2016. After the Conservatives won an overall majority at the 2015 general election, Osborne was reappointed Chancellor of the Exchequer by Cameron in his second government. Osborne also received the honorific title of First Secretary of State. July Budget 2015. Osborne announced on 16 May that he would deliver a second budget on 8 July, and promised action on tax avoidance by the rich by bringing in a «Google tax» designed to discourage large companies diverting profits out of the UK to avoid tax. In addition, large companies would now have to publish their UK tax strategies. Any large businesses that persistently engaged in aggressive tax planning would be subject to special measures. However, comments made by Osborne in 2003 on BBC Two's Daily Politics programme then resurfaced. These regarded the avoidance of inheritance tax and using clever financial products to pass the value of homeowners' properties to their children, and were widely criticised by politicians and journalists as hypocritical. The second budget also increased funding for the National Health Service, more apprenticeships, efforts to increase productivity, and cuts to the welfare budget. In response, the Conservative-led Local Government Association, on behalf of 375 Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat-run councils, said that further austerity measures were not an option as they would devastate local services. They said that local councils had already had to make cuts of 40% since 2010, and couldn't make any more cuts without serious consequences for the most vulnerable. After the budget, many departments were told to work out the effect on services of spending cuts from 25% to 40% by 2019-20. This prompted fears that services the public takes for granted could be hit, and concern that the Conservative Party had not explained the policy clearly in its manifesto. Before the 2015 election, Osborne announced the introduction of a national living wage of £7.20 per hour, rising to £9 per hour by 2020, which would apply to those aged 25 or over. This was widely cheered by both Conservative MPs and political commentators. He also announced a raise in the income tax personal allowance to £11,000, measures to introduce tax incentives for large corporations to create apprenticeships, aiming for 3 million new apprenticeships by 2020, and a cut in the benefits cap to £23,000 in London and £20,000 in the rest of the country. The July budget postponed the predicted arrival of a UK surplus from 2019 to 2020, and included an extra £18 billion more borrowing for 2016 to 20 than planned for the same period in March. In the July budget, Osborne also planned to cut tax credits, which top up pay for low-income workers, prompting claims that this represented a breach of promises made by colleagues before the general election in May. Following public opposition and a House of Lords vote against the changes, Osborne scrapped these changes in the 2015 autumn statement, saying that higher-than-expected tax receipts gave him more room for maneuver. The IFs noted that Osborne's proposals implied that tax credits would still be cut as part of the switch to universal credit in 2018. Thank you for watching. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.